When 42-year-old Claire Donovan signed the deed to an abandoned fire lookout station buried deep in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains with the last $9,800 from her divorce settlement, the county clerk actually asked if she was being coerced. The building hadn't been occupied in 30 years, had no road access beyond an overgrown trail, and according to forestry records, was structurally unsound and scheduled for demolition. But what Claire discovered in the tower's sealed upper room, hidden behind false paneling installed by a reclusive park ranger who died under mysterious circumstances, would expose a stolen art collection worth $89 million and unravel a conspiracy that reached from World War II Europe to the highest levels of American museum curation. For what she found in that windswept tower, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and the ghosts of ponderosa pines, would prove that some secrets don't just hide in vaults and mansions, they hide in the last places anyone thinks to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The January morning was the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache. Claire's 12-year-old Subaru Outback struggled up the Forest Service road, tires slipping on black ice that had formed overnight in the shadows where sunlight never reached. In the passenger seat, her 8-year-old border collie mix, Scout, stood with his front paws on the dashboard, ears perked forward as he watched the forest close in around them. The trees here were massive, old-growth firs and pines that the logging companies had somehow missed, their trunks wider than her car, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even in mid-morning, the world felt like perpetual dusk. In the back of the Subaru, Claire's entire post-divorce life was compressed into 11 boxes, 3 duffel bags, a sleeping bag rated for -20 degrees, a camp stove, and 2 5-gallon water containers. At 42, this was what remained after 16 years of marriage, a career as a museum archivist in Boston, and a year-long legal battle that had consumed everything she'd ever saved. The GPS had lost signal 40 minutes ago. Now she was navigating by a hand-drawn map the forestry office had provided, a photocopy so old the ink had faded to ghost lines. Tower Road was marked with a dotted line that ended abruptly at a handwritten notation, impassable. Foot traffic only beyond mile marker 7. She was at mile marker 6. The road had degraded from cracked pavement to gravel to what could generously be called a logging trail, 2 ruts separated by a spine of dead grass and rocks that scraped the Subaru's undercarriage with sounds that made her wince. "Almost there, Scout," she said, her voice breaking the silence that pressed in from all sides. The dog glanced at her, tail wagging once, then returned his attention to the windshield. He'd been through everything with her, the collapse of her marriage, the move from their Cambridge townhouse to a series of increasingly depressing apartments, the slow erosion of the life she'd built over 2 decades. Now he was following her into the wilderness, trusting that she knew what she was doing. She didn't. Not really. 18 months ago, Claire had been Dr. Claire Donovan, senior archivist at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She and her husband Marcus owned a narrow 3-story townhouse in Cambridge with original hardwood floors and a view of the Charles River. They hosted dinner parties. They took vacations to France and Italy. Life wasn't passionate anymore, hadn't been for years, but it was comfortable, predictable, secure. Then Marcus's affair with his dental hygienist became impossible to ignore. The divorce was brutal. He'd been the primary earner, his orthodontics practice brought in 4 times her museum salary, and somehow his lawyer had made it seem like Claire was the one who'd been living beyond her means. The townhouse went to Marcus. The retirement accounts were split, but legal fees devoured most of her share. Her job became unbearable, too many mutual friends asking probing questions, too much pity in the break room, too many reminders of the life she'd lost. She'd quit without another position lined up, which her therapist said was either self-sabotage or the first honest decision she'd made in years. Boston's cost of living was merciless. Her savings evaporated. She'd moved to a studio in Somerville, then to a cheaper place in Quincy, each apartment smaller and grimmer than the last. She'd applied for archivist positions across the country, but the job market was brutal, and at 42, she was competing against candidates half her age who'd work for half the salary. That's when the insomnia started, lying awake at 3 a.m., refreshing job sites, running calculations of how long her money would last, feeling the future narrow to a pinpoint of anxiety and dread. It was during one of those sleepless nights in November that she'd found the listing. She'd been scrolling through rural property sites with the kind of desperate, dissociative curiosity that comes from having no plan and nothing to lose. Most properties were tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Land in Montana was expensive, even in the middle of nowhere. But then she saw it, historic fire lookout station. 1 acres. Bitterroot National Forest boundary. $9,500 cash only. Buyer assumes all liability. Structure unfit for habitation. Land access only. The photo showed a squat wooden tower rising above the tree line, its windows dark, its exterior weathered to the color of old bone. Behind it, mountains rose in layers of blue and purple, their peaks lost in clouds. The listing was brutally clear about the property's condition: built 1938. Decommissioned 1987. No utilities. No road access beyond Forest Service trail. Structure has significant water damage and is condemned. Forestry Service plans demolition if not sold. Purchase price reflects land value only. Claire had $11,200 left in her checking account. It was supposed to last until she found work, until something changed, until the universe decided to stop punishing her for crimes she couldn't name. Looking at that listing at 3 a.m., broke, alone, exhausted from fighting, Claire made a decision that her sister would later call either courageous or insane. She would buy it. The plan, such as it was, made a certain desperate sense. The land was outside national forest boundaries, which meant she could legally camp on it. She'd buy a used camper trailer with her remaining money and live there while she figured out her next move. The tower itself was worthless, but Montana land was always worth something. If she needed to, she could sell it in a year or two, hopefully for more than she'd paid. It was a gamble. It was probably stupid. But it was also $9,500 for land versus $1,800 a month for a Quincy apartment where police sirens woke her every night and her upstairs neighbor dealt drugs to high school kids. The purchase process was surprisingly fast. The property had been owned by the Forestry Service until 1992, then sold to a private citizen named Thomas Whitmore, who'd held it until his death 5 years ago. No heirs, no will, the property had ended up in county hands after back taxes went unpaid. The county clerk, a tired woman named Mary Ann, had processed the paperwork with an expression somewhere between concern and resignation. "You seen the property?" Mary Ann had asked over the phone. "I've seen the photos. And you understand the structure is condemned. You can't live in it." "I understand. I'm buying the land." A pause. "May I ask what you plan to do with it?" "Camp on it. Maybe eventually build something small." Another pause, longer this time. When Mary Ann spoke again, her voice had gentled. "Miss Donovan, I'm required to tell you that Thomas Whitmore, the previous owner, died in that tower. They found him 3 weeks after he passed. Natural causes, they said, but..." She trailed off. "The place has a reputation. Local kids won't go near it. Some of the older rangers say Whitmore was paranoid toward the end, talking about people watching him, people after him. I just want you to know what you're buying." "I appreciate the warning," Claire had said. "But I still want to proceed." "All right then. As long as you understand what you're getting into." She didn't. Not remotely. But she'd signed the papers anyway, and now here she was, grinding up a Forest Service road that hadn't seen maintenance in a decade, heading toward a condemned tower that a dead man had haunted. The road ended abruptly at a rusted cable strung between 2 posts. Beyond it, a trail disappeared into the forest, narrow and overgrown, marked by a faded sign, Whitmore Tower 1. 8 miles. Foot traffic only. No vehicles beyond this point. Claire parked the Subaru, turned off the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. The only sound was wind moving through the pines, a soft rushing like distant water. Scout whined softly, sensing her hesitation. "Okay, Claire said aloud, her voice startling in the quiet. "This is it. Our new home. Our fresh start." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Fresh start. As if you could just restart your life, like rebooting a computer, wiping away all the painful data and beginning with a clean drive. As if the past year hadn't happened. As if Marcus hadn't happened. As if 42 years of building a careful, respectable life hadn't just collapsed like a house made of cards. She climbed out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, dry, sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and snow. Scout jumped out and immediately started quartering the area, nose down, tail up, glorying in space and smells after hours confined in the car. Claire walked to the cable barrier and looked up the trail. It climbed steeply through dense forest, the trees so thick she couldn't see more than 50 feet ahead. Somewhere up there, invisible from here, was the tower. Her tower now. A condemned structure on 2 acres of mountain land, purchased with the last of her money in an act of either desperation or madness. She thought about calling her sister, about hearing Emily's voice telling her this was all going to be okay, that she'd made the right choice. But there was no cell signal here. There was nothing here except trees, silence, and the weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire spent the next hour shuttling supplies up the trail. She'd bought a game cart, a wheeled carrier hunters used to haul deer out of the woods, and she loaded it with boxes and bags, pushing and pulling it up the steep, rocky path. Scout ranged ahead, appearing and disappearing, always circling back to check on her progress. The trail was worse than she'd expected. Fallen trees blocked the path in 3 places, forcing her to unload the cart and carry everything over the obstacles. Erosion had carved deep channels that made the cart's wheels useless, requiring her to drag it like a sled. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her legs burned. Sweat soaked through her thermal layers despite the cold. This was insane. She was insane. A museum archivist with a PhD in art history, hauling her possessions up a mountain to live in a condemned tower because her life had fallen apart and she'd run out of better options. The tower appeared suddenly, the trail opening into a small clearing perhaps 50 yards across. Claire stopped, chest heaving, and stared. It was both worse and better than she'd expected. The structure was larger than the photos had suggested, a 2-story wooden building with a tower rising another story above that, topped by the glass-enclosed observation room. The building's foundation was massive logs, chinked with what looked like original mortar from the 1930s. The siding was cedar shakes, weathered to silver gray, many missing or hanging loose. The windows on the lower floors were dark and empty, some broken, some just open rectangles where glass had been. But the tower itself, rising above the main structure, still had most of its glass intact, and something about its height, its commanding view of the surrounding forest and distant mountains, made Claire's breath catch. This place had been built to watch for fires, to serve as an early warning system protecting thousands of acres of wilderness. Whoever had built it had understood the importance of elevation, of perspective, of seeing threats before they became disasters. The clearing around the tower was overgrown with dead grass and brush. A rusted propane tank lay on its side near the building. An old woodpile, reduced to rotting pulp, slumped against the north wall. There was a metal shed, door hanging open, empty except for some rusted tools and a broken chair. And at the edge of the clearing, almost hidden by encroaching forest, was a small outbuilding, maybe a storage shed or old outhouse, its roof collapsed inward. But beyond all that, beyond the decay and abandonment, the view was staggering. The clearing sat on a high shoulder of the mountain, and to the west, the land fell away in rolling waves of forest descending to a valley, beyond which another range of mountains rose like frozen waves, their peaks white with early snow. The sky was huge here, bigger than any sky Claire had seen, stretching from horizon to horizon without obstruction. She could see weather moving in the distance, a dark curtain of snow falling from clouds that hadn't reached them yet, sunlight breaking through gaps to illuminate patches of forest in brilliant gold. Scout had bounded up to the tower and was now sniffing around the entrance, tail wagging uncertainly. The main door was closed but not locked, the handle turned with stiff resistance, and the door swung inward on hinges that shrieked with rust. Inside, the smell hit her immediately: mildew, rot, animal droppings, and beneath it all, something else. The ghost scent of wood smoke, coffee, human habitation. Claire stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was one large room, maybe 20 feet by 30, with exposed beam ceiling. A cast iron stove sat against one wall, its pipe rising to disappear through the roof. There was a table, handmade from rough planks, with 2 chairs that looked sturdy despite their age. A narrow cot frame with no mattress. Open shelving along the walls, mostly empty except for some rusted cans and what looked like old books swollen with moisture. A ladder in the corner led upward, presumably to the tower observation room. Claire tested the first rung carefully. It held. She climbed slowly, the ladder creaking but solid, emerging into a smaller room, maybe 10 by 10, with windows on all 4 sides. This must have been the actual lookout station, where rangers would spend their shifts watching for smoke. The windows were filmed with dirt and spider webs, but intact. The room was empty except for an old desk built into one wall and a chair that had seen better decades. And taped to the walls, yellow with age, were maps. Topographic maps showing the surrounding wilderness, marked with what looked like fire spotting notes, dates, locations, observations in faded pencil. Some of the maps dated back to the 1960s, others to the 70s and 80s. Claire touched one gently. The paper was brittle, beginning to crumble at the edges. But something about seeing this record of human attention, of someone sitting in this room year after year watching over the forest, protecting it, something about that made her throat tighten. She climbed back down and called Scout, who'd been sniffing suspiciously at something in the corner. "Come on, boy. Let's see what else is here." There was another door in the main room, partially hidden behind a hanging tarp. Claire pulled the tarp aside, releasing a cloud of dust that made her cough. The door opened into what must have been storage, a narrow room, maybe 6 feet deep, lined with metal shelving. Most of the shelves held debris, mouse-chewed cardboard boxes, old newspapers from the 1980s, empty jars, a broken kerosene lamp. But on the top shelf, pushed far back against the wall, Claire spotted something different. A metal box, military green, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide. She had to stand on tiptoe to reach it. The box was heavier than expected, and when she pulled it down, she heard things shifting inside. Scout was suddenly alert, that focused intensity he got when he sensed something important. His tail went still, ears forward, eyes locked on the box. Claire's hands were shaking as she carried the box to the table. There was a clasp but no lock. She opened it. Inside, wrapped carefully in what looked like oiled canvas, were books. Not ordinary books, these were leather-bound, expensive-looking, their pages gilt-edged. Claire lifted the first one out carefully. The cover was embossed with gold letters, partially worn away, but she could make out, Kunsthistorisches Museum Wien 1911. Her German was rusty, but she knew that name. The Art History Museum in Vienna. She opened the book. Inside were photographs, black and white, exquisitely detailed images of paintings. Renaissance works, Baroque masterpieces, each photograph carefully labeled with artist name, date, dimensions. But across many of the images, someone had drawn red X marks. And in margins, in careful handwriting, were notes: looted 1938, seized by Nazis, current location unknown. Claire's heart began to pound. She pulled out another book. This one was a catalogue from the Louvre, dated 1936. Again, photographs of paintings, again, red X marks and marginal notes tracking theft, seizure, disappearance. A third book was from a private collection in Prague. A fourth from a gallery in Amsterdam. All pre-war. All meticulously marked to show which pieces had been stolen during the Nazi occupation of Europe. Beneath the books was a leather portfolio. Inside were documents, photocopies mostly, but some originals on yellowing paper. Property records. Shipping manifests. Letters in German, French, Italian. And photographs, dozens of them, showing art being crated, loaded onto trucks, stored in warehouses. Claire spread them across the table, her hands trembling now. She was looking at documentation of Nazi art theft. Thousands of pieces had been stolen from museums and private collections across Europe during World War II. Most had been recovered after the war, returned to their rightful owners or institutions. But some, hundreds, maybe thousands, had simply vanished, absorbed into private collections, sold through black market dealers, their provenance carefully obscured. And someone, some park ranger who'd died alone in this tower, had been tracking them. But why? And how? Claire pulled out the last item in the box, a thick envelope, sealed but not addressed. She opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined paper, dated March 1985. To whoever finds this, my name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. Maybe 6 months. I'm writing this because the truth needs to be told, even if I'm not brave enough to tell it while I'm still alive. What I'm about to tell you will sound insane. I know because I've been living with it for 40 years, and some days even I wonder if I imagine it all. But the evidence is here. The photographs, the documents, the proof. It's all real. In 1945, I was a private in the U.S. Army, part of the forces liberating Europe. We weren't combat troops, we were support, logistics, the guys who came in after the shooting stopped to clean up and get things running again. My unit was assigned to a small town in southern Germany. The details don't matter. What matters is what we found in a warehouse on the edge of town. Art. Hundreds of pieces. Paintings, sculptures, artifacts. Stolen by the Nazis from museums and private collections all over Europe. Most of it was logged, documented, eventually returned. But not all of it. The letter continued for several pages, describing how a captain in Whitmore's unit had quietly set aside certain pieces, the most valuable, the easiest to transport, the hardest to trace. How this captain had shipped them back to the States using military supply channels, disguised as personal effects. How after the war, these pieces had entered the American art market, sold to museums and private collectors with false provenances that made them seem legitimate. The captain's name was Richard Blackwell. He died in 1978, heart attack, they said, though I've always wondered. Before he died, he contacted me. We hadn't spoken in 30 years, but he knew I was the only person alive who'd witnessed what he did in Germany. He was afraid, paranoid someone was going to expose him. He gave me everything, documentation, photographs, lists of pieces he'd stolen and where they'd ended up. He made me promise I'd keep it hidden, that I'd protect his legacy. I agreed because I was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do if I refused. But now I'm dying, and I realize I've spent 40 years protecting a thief and a liar. The art he stole belongs in museums, belongs to the families it was taken from. And some of those pieces, dozens of them, are currently in major American institutions, displayed as legitimate acquisitions. The most valuable single piece is worth approximately $12 million, a Rembrandt that Blackwell sold to the Carson Museum in San Francisco in 1967, claiming it had been in his family for generations. It's on display there right now, admired by thousands of people every year. None of them know they're looking at stolen property. I've documented everything I know. The lists, the photographs, the paper trail showing how Blackwell moved these pieces from Germany to the States and eventually into the legitimate art market. It's all in this tower, hidden where no one will find it unless they're looking. Because I'm a coward. I couldn't bring myself to go public while I was alive, couldn't face the scandal, the questions, the possibility that I'd be prosecuted for keeping silent. So I'm leaving the evidence here, hoping that someday, someone will find it and have the courage I lacked. If that person is you, please. Tell the truth. Return the art to where it belongs. Don't let these stolen treasures remain hidden in plain sight. The families who lost them deserve justice. The museums deserve to know what they're really displaying. And Richard Blackwell's theft shouldn't be protected by my silence anymore. The letter was signed Thomas Whitmore and dated at the bottom. Claire read it 3 times, her mind racing. If this was real, if even half of it was real, she was looking at one of the most significant discoveries in art history. $89 million. The letter had mentioned a specific figure, but she'd been so focused on the story she'd nearly missed it. The total estimated value of the pieces Blackwell stole and sold is approximately $89 million in today's market. Claire sat down hard on one of the old chairs. Scout pressed against her leg, whining softly, sensing her shock. She'd come here to hide, to escape, to figure out how to survive. Instead, she'd stumbled into exactly the kind of historical conspiracy she'd spent her career studying from safe academic distance. The difference was this wasn't theoretical. This was real. There was evidence sitting on this table. Evidence that could upend reputations, expose museums, reunite families with lost treasures. Evidence that powerful institutions would desperately want to suppress or discredit. And she was alone in a condemned tower in the middle of Montana wilderness with no cell signal, no witnesses, and no one who even knew she was here. Claire stood abruptly, walked to the door, and looked out at the clearing. The sun had moved while she'd been reading, afternoon light slanting through the trees, shadows lengthening. Weather was moving in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the distant peaks. She had maybe an hour before that storm hit, and she still needed to set up some kind of shelter for the night. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd found. Couldn't stop thinking about Thomas Whitmore dying in this tower, surrounded by evidence he'd been too afraid to share. Couldn't stop thinking about all those stolen paintings hanging in museums, their true history hidden behind false paperwork and decades of institutional silence. She thought about her career, 16 years as a museum archivist, specializing in provenance research. She knew how difficult it was to trace artwork's ownership history, especially pieces that had changed hands during the chaos of World War II. She knew how many museums had objects in their collections with questionable origins, gaps in their documentation that everyone quietly agreed not to examine too closely. This evidence could change everything. Or it could get her killed. Claire returned to the table and carefully repacked the metal box. She carried it back to the storage room and placed it exactly where she'd found it. Then she stood there, hands shaking, trying to decide what to do next. The smart thing would be to leave. Pack up, drive back to civilization, sell the property sight unseen, forget she'd ever found anything. Go back to her safe academic life, find a museum position somewhere, pretend this never happened. But she'd already lost her safe academic life. She'd already lost everything that mattered. And standing in this abandoned tower, holding evidence that a frightened old man had preserved for 40 years in the hope that someone would eventually find it and have the courage he lacked, standing here, Claire realized she was tired of being safe. Tired of being careful. Tired of letting other people determine what she was brave enough to do. "Okay, Whitmore," she said softly to the empty room. "I found your evidence. Now I just need to figure out what to do with it." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, soft and silent, covering the clearing in white. And in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of an engine, a vehicle climbing the Forest Service road toward the cable barrier. Someone was coming. The vehicle didn't come all the way up. Claire heard it idle at the cable barrier for several minutes, then the engine cut out. Silence returned, broken only by wind and the soft whisper of falling snow. She moved to the window, staying back in shadow, and watched. A figure emerged from the tree line, a man, tall and lean, wearing a ranger's uniform. Not Forestry Service green, but the distinctive gray and green of the National Park Service. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd spent years in wilderness, his eyes scanning the clearing, the tower, assessing everything before committing to approach. Scout growled low, the sound vibrating through his chest. Claire put a hand on the dog's head, quieting him. The ranger stopped about 30 feet from the tower and called out. "Hello? Miss Donovan? I'm Park Ranger Michael Chen. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just want to talk." His voice carried clearly in the cold air, calm and professional. Claire hesitated, then stepped to the doorway. How do you know my name? County clerk mentioned you'd purchased the property. We try to keep track of who's living in proximity to the national forest. Fire safety, wildlife management, that kind of thing. He held up both hands, showing them empty. Mind if I come closer? Getting cold out here. Claire studied him. He looked to be in his mid-50s, Asian features weathered by sun and wind, dark hair going gray at the temples. His uniform was worn but clean, boots scuffed with actual use. There was something in his posture that suggested military background, that particular way of standing that came from years of discipline. "All right," she said finally. "But my dog doesn't like surprises, so move slow." Michael approached carefully, his eyes moving between Claire and Scout. When he was close enough, she could see the name tape on his uniform clearly, Chen M. Below it, a patch reading Bitterroot National Forest Wilderness Ranger. "Hell of a place to buy," he said, glancing up at the tower. "You know it's condemned?" "I'm aware. I bought the land, not the structure." "Fair enough. You planning to stay here? Is that illegal?" "No, ma'am. Like I said, just checking in. We don't get many new residents up here. Last person to live in this tower was Thomas Whitmore, and that didn't end well." Claire kept her expression neutral. "I heard he died here. Found him myself, actually. 3 weeks after he passed. Not a pleasant discovery." Michael's eyes moved to the clearing, the outbuildings, then back to Claire. "You here alone?" "Me and my dog. No cell service up here. No power. No running water. Winter's coming hard, we're expecting a major storm system in the next week. You prepared for that?" "I'm working on it." Michael nodded slowly. "Look, Miss Donovan, I'm not trying to run you off. It's your property, you've got every right to be here. But I've been ranging these mountains for 30 years, and I've seen what happens to people who underestimate the wilderness. It's not forgiving." "I appreciate the concern," Claire said carefully. "But I've made my decision." "All right then." Michael pulled a card from his pocket and held it out. Claire took it, heavy cardstock with an official Park Service logo, contact information printed below his name. "That's my number. Obviously won't work up here, but if you make it down to where there's signal and you need anything, medical emergency, weather information, whatever, you call that number. We look after each other in these mountains." "Thank you." Michael turned to go, then paused. "One more thing. Thomas Whitmore, toward the end, he got paranoid. Started telling people he was being watched, that someone was after him. Most folks figured it was just old age, isolation playing tricks on his mind. But a few weeks before he died, he came down to the ranger station and tried to tell me something. Said he had evidence of crimes, said important people were involved. I thought he was confused, maybe suffering from dementia. I didn't take him seriously." His expression shifted, something like regret crossing his features. "I've always wondered if I should have listened more carefully." Claire's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you think he meant?" "I don't know. He died before I could follow up. But after they found his body, some people came around asking questions. Not police, not family, well-dressed people with expensive vehicles and the kind of authority that doesn't need a badge. They searched this tower pretty thoroughly, or so I heard. Whatever they were looking for, I don't think they found it." He met her eyes directly. "If you find anything up here, anything unusual, anything that seems important, you might want to think carefully about what you do with it. Some secrets stay buried for good reasons." "I'll keep that in mind." Michael nodded once more and walked back toward the trail, disappearing into the trees. Claire stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, watching snow accumulate in the clearing, her mind racing. Well-dressed people with expensive vehicles searching the tower after Whitmore died. Which meant someone knew, or at least suspected, what he'd been hiding. Which meant Claire finding it now, 40 years after the initial theft, decades after Whitmore's death. That wasn't coincidence. That was dangerous. She went back inside and returned to the storage room. The metal box sat exactly where she'd replaced it, innocuous, just another piece of forgotten junk in an abandoned building. Except it wasn't. It was evidence worth $89 million, evidence that could destroy reputations, expose institutions, potentially send people to prison. And someone had already tried to find it once. They might try again. Claire made a decision. She couldn't leave the evidence here, not where anyone searching would eventually find it. But she also couldn't carry it with her, too risky, too obvious. She needed to hide it properly, somewhere no one would think to look. She spent the next hour working in the fading afternoon light. First, she photographed every page of every document, every photograph in the collection, using her phone's camera. The battery was at 60%, and she had a solar charger, but she worked quickly anyway, methodically documenting everything. The books, the letters, the shipping manifests, Whitmore's handwritten notes, all of it captured digitally. When she finished, she had over 300 photographs stored on her phone. She transferred them to her laptop, then uploaded everything to 3 different cloud storage accounts, making sure the evidence existed in multiple locations that couldn't be destroyed if something happened to the physical documents. Then she carefully rewrapped the originals in their oiled canvas and placed them back in the metal box. But instead of returning the box to the storage room, she carried it outside. The snow was falling steadily now, already covering the ground in a thin white blanket. Claire walked to the collapsed outbuilding at the edge of the clearing, the old storage shed with the caved-in roof. The structure was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, its walls still standing despite the collapsed roof. Inside was a jumble of rotted timber, rusted metal, and debris accumulated over decades. Claire worked quickly, her hands going numb in the cold. She dug beneath the debris in the far corner, creating a hollow space about 2 feet deep. She placed the metal box at the bottom, then covered it with rocks she gathered from around the clearing, creating a cairn that would bear weight without crushing the box. Over that, she replaced the rotted timber and debris, arranging it to look exactly as it had before, random, chaotic, worthless junk that no one would bother disturbing. When she finished, her hands were bleeding from scrapes and her clothes were soaked through, but the evidence was hidden. Someone could search the tower for weeks and never think to excavate beneath the debris in a collapsed outbuilding. Scout watched from the doorway, occasionally whining his concern but trusting her judgment. Claire returned to the tower, stripped off her wet clothes, and put on every dry layer she owned. The temperature was dropping fast, probably already below 20 degrees and headed lower. She needed to set up some kind of heat source before nightfall. The cast iron stove in the main room was rusted but intact. Claire had bought firewood from a gas station on her way up, 5 bundles of seasoned pine and oak. It wouldn't last long, but it would get her through tonight. She crumpled newspaper, arranged kindling, struck a match. The fire caught slowly, smoking heavily until the chimney drew properly, then settling into a steady burn. Heat began to radiate from the stove, pushing back the cold. Claire made instant ramen on her camp stove, fed Scout his kibble, and tried to think through her next moves. She needed to contact someone about what she'd found, but who? Local police wouldn't know how to handle something this complex. The FBI? They had an art crimes division, but would they take her seriously? She was a recently divorced archivist living in a condemned tower, claiming to have evidence of Nazi art theft dating back to World War II. She needed credibility, needed someone with authority in the art world who could verify what she'd found and help navigate the political nightmare of exposing major museums. The name came to her around 9 p.m., sitting by the stove with Scout's head on her lap, watching shadows dance across the walls. Dr. Sarah Blackwood. They'd worked together briefly when Claire had been at the MFA in Boston. Sarah was now director of provenance research at the Smithsonian, one of the most respected voices in the field. If anyone could help verify the documents and guide the process of returning stolen art, it was Sarah. But contacting her would require cell service, internet, civilization. Which meant Claire would need to make the trip back down the mountain, drive to where her phone worked, and hope that Sarah remembered her after all these years. And hope that whoever had searched this tower after Whitmore's death wasn't monitoring communications, wasn't waiting for someone to surface with his evidence. Claire fed another log into the stove and watched sparks spiral up the chimney. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and silent, erasing tracks, covering evidence, making the world clean and blank. By morning, there would be no sign anyone had disturbed the collapsed outbuilding. No sign anyone had been here at all. She was about to settle into her sleeping bag when Scout's head jerked up, ears forward, a low growl building in his throat. Claire froze. "What is it, boy?" The dog moved to the door, that focused intensity radiating from every line of his body. Claire stood slowly, moving to the window. The clearing was dark, the falling snow creating a shifting curtain of white that made it impossible to see clearly. But there, movement near the tree line. A figure, or maybe two, dark shapes moving between the pines. Claire's blood went cold. She killed the camp stove, let the fire in the wood stove burn down to coals. In the near darkness, she moved to the storage room and grabbed a rusted hatchet she'd seen earlier, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Scout was at the door, hackles up, that growl constant now. "Quiet, Scout. Quiet." The dog obeyed but remained tense, coiled. Minutes passed. The shapes in the tree line didn't approach, didn't retreat. Just watched. Waiting. Claire's mind raced through possibilities. Local kids? Possible, but unlikely in this weather, this late. Wildlife? The shapes were too deliberate, too aware. Rangers checking on her? Not at this hour, not in this weather, not without announcing themselves. Which left the option she didn't want to consider. People looking for what Whitmore had hidden. People who'd searched once and were back to search again. People who might not be happy about finding someone living in the tower now, someone who might have already discovered what they'd spent years trying to find. The shapes moved closer. Definitely two of them, spreading out to approach from different angles. Professional, coordinated. Claire felt terror spike through her chest. She was alone in a condemned tower with no cell service, no way to call for help, no neighbors for miles. If something happened to her here, it might be weeks before anyone found her. Just like they'd found Whitmore. She moved to the ladder leading up to the observation room. "Scout, come. Quiet now." The dog followed her up, silent except for his breathing. In the observation room, Claire could see better. The elevated position gave her visibility across the entire clearing. The two figures had reached the edge, were now moving toward the tower itself. Both wore dark clothing, faces obscured. One carried something, a flashlight, or maybe something else. They split up. One headed for the main door. The other circled around back. Claire's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. No signal, but she opened the camera app anyway, started recording video. If something happened to her, at least there might be evidence. The figure at the main door tested the handle. Claire had locked it, a flimsy internal lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might by seconds. The handle rattled. A pause. Then a voice, male, speaking quietly to someone else. Claire couldn't make out words, but the tone was professional, coordinated. Not random intruders. Not lost hikers. The figure at the back of the tower was trying a window. Claire heard the frame being tested, wood creaking. Then suddenly, a sound that made her blood freeze. A vehicle engine, getting closer. Headlights swept through the trees on the access trail. The two figures froze, then moved quickly back toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness as if they'd never been there. The vehicle, a pickup truck, Claire could see now, pulled into the clearing. The driver got out, and in the wash of the headlights, Claire recognized Ranger Michael Chen. He called out, his voice carrying clearly. "Miss Donovan? Everything okay up here? Saw tracks on the trail that looked fresh, wanted to make sure you were all right." Claire climbed down the ladder and opened the door. The relief was so intense her legs nearly gave out. "I'm fine. But there were people here. Two of them. They were trying to get into the tower." Michael's expression sharpened. He pulled a flashlight and swept it across the clearing, toward the tree line. "Where?" They went into the trees when they heard you coming. East side of the clearing. Michael moved in that direction, following tracks in the fresh snow. Claire and Scout followed, staying close. The tracks were clear, 2 sets, large boots, deliberate path. They led into the forest about 50 yards, then to a spot where another vehicle had been parked. Tire tracks, now being rapidly covered by snow, led back to a different trail, one Claire hadn't known existed. They came in the back way, Michael said, studying the tracks. There's an old logging road that connects to the highway about 5 miles north. Forestry Service doesn't maintain it anymore, but someone who knew the area could use it. He looked at Claire. You get a look at them? 2 people, dark clothes, moving like they knew what they were doing. They were trying to get inside. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Miss Donovan, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you find something in that tower? Something Thomas Whitmore left behind? Claire's instinct was to deny it, but looking at Michael's face in the flashlight beam, the concern there, the intensity, she made a judgment call. Yes. What kind of something? Evidence. Documents. Related to art theft during World War II. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Jesus. He actually kept it. After all these years, he actually kept it. You knew? Not for certain. But 30 years ranging these mountains, you hear things. Old-timers talk. There were rumors that Whitmore had been involved in something during the war, that he knew about stolen art, maybe had helped move some of it through military channels. But it was always just rumors, the kind of stories people tell about the weird guy living alone in the forest. He opened his eyes. If what you found is real, if it can prove those rumors, there are people who would kill to keep that quiet. Museums, private collectors, families who've built their reputations on collections that might turn out to be stolen property. We're talking billions of dollars, Miss Donovan. Billions in art that's been laundered through decades of false provenance. 89 million, Claire said. According to Whitmore's documentation, that's the value of what he tracked. Michael whistled low. And you have this evidence? I've documented it. Photographed everything. The originals are hidden. Good. That's good. But you need to understand, you can't stay here now. Not after this. Those people will come back, and next time I might not show up to scare them off. I have nowhere else to go, Claire said, hating how defeated she sounded. This property is all I have left. Michael studied her for a moment. All right. Here's what we're going to do. Tonight, you come down to the ranger station. It's about 20 miles from here, but it's heated, secure, and I can make sure no one bothers you. Tomorrow, we figure out how to contact the right authorities, how to turn over this evidence without you getting hurt or the evidence getting buried. Why are you helping me? Because 30 years ago, I didn't help Thomas Whitmore when he tried to tell me the truth. I'm not making that mistake twice. They drove down in Claire's Subaru, Michael following in his truck. The ranger station was a small compound, 2 buildings, solar panels on the roofs, generator shed, satellite dish for communications. Michael showed her to a guest room, simple but clean, with a real bed and a bathroom with running water heated by propane. Scout collapsed on the floor, exhausted from the day's stress. Claire sat on the bed and felt the adrenaline finally drain, leaving her shaking and hollow. Michael brought coffee and sat across from her in the small common room. Tell me everything. From the beginning. What you found, what it says, who's implicated. Claire walked him through it all. The metal box, the catalogs, the photographs, Whitmore's letter. The documentation of stolen art, the trail showing how pieces had entered American museums under false provenance. The specific mention of the Rembrandt at the Carson Museum, worth $12 million alone. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. The Carson Museum, he said finally. That's going to be a problem. Why? The director, Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, she's one of the most powerful people in the American art world. Sits on boards for major museums across the country. Her family has donated hundreds of millions to various institutions. If you accuse her museum of displaying stolen art, she'll come after you with everything she has: lawyers, private investigators, media campaigns to destroy your credibility. But if the evidence proves it, evidence can be discredited. Experts can be bought. Whitmore's letter could be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a dying man. You're a recent divorcee with no job, living in a condemned tower in Montana. How do you think that plays in court? Claire felt her hope crumble. So we can't win. Even with proof, we can't win. I didn't say that. I said it's going to be hard. But there's a path forward. Michael leaned forward. We need to get this evidence to someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone whose reputation is unimpeachable. You know anyone like that in the art world? Dr. Sarah Blackwood, Claire said immediately. Director of Provenance Research at the Smithsonian. I worked with her years ago. She's brilliant, ethical, and she's spent her career fighting for proper documentation and return of stolen art. Can you trust her? I think so. But I haven't spoken to her in 5 years. Then we make that the first call tomorrow. In the meantime, you need to transfer all your digital documentation to me as well. Multiple copies in multiple locations. If something happens to you, don't, Claire interrupted. Please don't finish that sentence. Michael's expression softened. I'm sorry. But you need to understand what you're up against. The people who came to the tower tonight, they're not going to give up. And if they figure out you've already found and documented the evidence, you become a liability. We need to move fast, get this information into the right hands before they can stop us. Claire pulled out her phone and began transferring files to Michael's laptop. 300 photographs, gigabytes of data, flowing from her device to his over the ranger station's satellite internet. It took almost an hour. When it finished, Michael backed everything up to an external drive, then to a cloud account, creating multiple redundancies. Okay, he said. Now even if they destroy the physical evidence, even if they get to your phone or laptop, the documentation survives. Why are you doing this? Claire asked again. Why risk yourself for something that happened 80 years ago? Michael was quiet for a moment. My grandfather was Chinese, immigrated to California in the 1930s. He owned a small grocery store in San Francisco. When the war started, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, even though China was our ally. Someone accused my grandfather of being a Japanese sympathizer, completely false, but it didn't matter. They burned his store. Everything he'd built, gone in one night. And the person who did it never faced consequences. The official report said it was an accident. My grandfather knew the truth, but he was an immigrant, didn't speak perfect English, had no political power. So he stayed quiet and rebuilt from nothing. He looked at Claire directly. I grew up hearing that story. Hearing about how power protects power, how injustice gets buried when it's convenient for the people in charge. Thomas Whitmore tried to expose a different injustice, and he died alone and ignored. I didn't help him then. But I can help you now. I can make sure this time, the truth doesn't get buried. Outside, the snow had stopped. Through the window, Claire could see stars emerging between clouds, cold and distant and infinite. Somewhere in museums across America, stolen art hung on walls, admired by visitors who had no idea they were looking at the spoils of war. Somewhere, the descendants of families who'd lost those treasures mourned what had been taken from them. And somewhere, people with money and power and reputations to protect were deciding what to do about the woman who'd found evidence of their crimes. Claire thought about Marcus, about her careful career, about all the years she'd spent being safe and respectable and afraid to make waves. She thought about standing in that tower this morning, reading Whitmore's letter, feeling the weight of his fear and regret. She thought about the choice ahead of her, stay silent and safe, or speak truth and face consequences. All right, she said quietly. Tomorrow we call Sarah Blackwood. We get the evidence verified and documented by someone the art world respects. And then we go public, whatever happens next. Michael nodded. Whatever happens next. Claire tried to sleep but couldn't. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, Scout snoring on the floor beside her, and watched dawn come slowly to the mountains. Gray light filtering through curtains, the promise of morning, the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped or undone. She'd come to Montana to hide. Instead, she'd found a reason to fight. And somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, she heard her father's voice, dead 15 years now, but still clear in memory. He'd been a history professor, had taught her that the past never truly passes, that injustice deferred is just injustice compounded. She'd spent her career studying history from safe academic distance. Now history had reached out and grabbed her, demanding she choose what kind of person she wanted to be. The kind who looked away, or the kind who bore witness. By the time full daylight arrived, Claire had made her peace with the choice. There was no going back to the life she'd lost. There was only forward, into whatever came next. The call to Sarah Blackwood happened at 7:30 that morning, from Michael's satellite phone with its scratchy delay that made conversation feel like speaking across decades instead of miles. Claire stood by the window of the ranger station, watching early light paint the snow-covered peaks gold and pink, while she explained to her former colleague that she'd found evidence of one of the largest art theft conspiracies in American history. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Sarah's voice, careful and measured. "Claire, I need you to understand how serious this is. If what you're describing is authentic, and I'm not saying I doubt you, but I need to see the evidence myself, this will destroy careers, bankrupt institutions, potentially lead to criminal prosecutions. People will fight this with everything they have. I know. And you're prepared for that? For your name to be attached to this? For the scrutiny, the legal battles, the attempts to discredit you?" Claire thought about the tower, about Whitmore dying alone with his secrets. About the families who'd lost treasures and never known where they'd ended up. About all the years she'd spent being careful, playing it safe, protecting institutions instead of truth. "I'm prepared." Another pause. "All right. I'm flying to Montana today. Don't show this evidence to anyone else, don't make copies beyond what you've already done, and for God's sake don't go back to that tower until I've seen what you have. Where can I meet you?" Michael gave her the ranger station coordinates. Sarah said she'd charter a flight to Missoula, rent a car, and be there by evening. When Claire hung up, her hands were shaking. Michael handed her coffee. "That's the first step. Once Sarah verifies the documents, everything changes. The Smithsonian's institutional weight protects both of you. Even powerful museums won't dare attack the Smithsonian directly. What about before tonight? What if those people come back? Then we make sure you're not alone." Michael made several calls, and within 2 hours, 3 other rangers had arrived at the station, 2 men and a woman, all with the same weathered competence as Michael. They established a perimeter, set up motion sensors on the access roads, made it clear that Claire was under their protection. She spent the day organizing the digital files, creating a comprehensive index of every piece of stolen art documented in Whitmore's collection. There were 73 pieces in total, paintings, sculptures, artifacts, stolen from museums and private collections across Europe between 1938 and 1945. Most had been taken by Nazi forces, but the theft that Whitmore documented was different. This was American soldiers, part of the liberation forces, who'd seen opportunity in the chaos of war's end and had quietly set aside the most valuable pieces for themselves. Captain Richard Blackwell had been the mastermind, but according to Whitmore's notes, he hadn't worked alone. There had been at least 6 other soldiers involved, all of whom had returned to the States with stolen art disguised as war souvenirs or personal effects. Over the following decades, these pieces had been carefully laundered into the legitimate art market through false provenance documentation, eventually finding homes in major American museums. The Rembrandt at the Carson Museum was just the most valuable single piece. There were others, a Vermeer at a private foundation in Texas, a collection of medieval manuscripts at a university in Connecticut, Renaissance bronzes scattered across institutions from Boston to Los Angeles. Each one had a false history carefully constructed to hide its true origin. Each one represented not just monetary value, but a family's stolen heritage, a museum's pillaged collection, a piece of cultural history that had been violently separated from its rightful home. Claire thought about her years working in museum archives, processing acquisitions, researching provenance. How many times had she encountered suspicious gaps in documentation and simply accepted the official explanation? How many times had she been part of the system that protected these thefts through willful blindness? Sarah Blackwood arrived at 6:15 that evening, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. She looked exactly as Claire remembered, tall, silver hair cut short, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of being the smartest person in the room. She embraced Claire briefly. "You look terrible. I've been living in a condemned tower and getting threatened by art thieves. It's been a rough week." "I imagine so." Sarah turned to Michael. "You're the ranger who's been protecting her?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you. Now show me what you found." They spent 4 hours going through the evidence. Sarah examined every photograph, read every document, cross-referenced the stolen pieces against international databases of missing art. Her expression grew darker as the scope became clear. Finally, she sat back and removed her glasses, pressing fingers to her temples. "This is real. All of it. I've spent my career researching Nazi-looted art, and this documentation is consistent with everything we know about theft patterns during that period. The provenance papers Blackwell created are sophisticated forgeries, good enough to pass initial scrutiny, but they have inconsistencies that become obvious once you know what you're looking for. So the museum's displaying these pieces, they're all showing stolen property?" "Yes. Most acquired them in good faith, decades ago, trusting documentation that seemed legitimate at the time. But that doesn't change the legal reality. Under international law, stolen cultural property must be returned to its rightful owners, regardless of how much time has passed or how many times the piece has changed hands." Sarah looked at Claire directly. "This is going to cause a crisis in the American museum world. Institutions will have to return pieces worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Curators who built their careers around these collections will be discredited. Donors who funded acquisitions will demand refunds. It's going to be ugly." "But it's necessary," Claire said. "Yes. It's necessary." Sarah began making phone calls, to the director of the Smithsonian, to FBI Art Crimes Division, to international agencies that specialized in recovering looted cultural property. By midnight, a plan was in place. The Smithsonian would take custody of the physical evidence, verify it through their research teams, and coordinate with law enforcement for criminal investigation. Simultaneously, they would contact the families and institutions from whom the art had originally been stolen, beginning the process of repatriation. And Claire's role in the discovery would be protected, her name would be public, but the Smithsonian would make clear she'd acted purely in the interest of historical truth, deflecting any attempts to paint her as opportunistic or unreliable. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as they were wrapping up. "Thomas Whitmore. He preserved this evidence for 40 years, but he never received recognition for it. I think it's important that his role be acknowledged. He was a whistleblower before we had a name for it, someone who risked everything to document wrongdoing even though he was too afraid to expose it during his lifetime. He left a letter," Claire said. "Explaining everything, apologizing for his silence. It's with the other documents. Then we make sure that letter is part of the public record. His story matters, not just what he preserved, but why he kept it hidden, and what it cost him to carry that burden alone." The next morning, Claire and Michael drove back to the tower to retrieve the physical evidence. Sarah came with them, along with 2 FBI agents who'd flown in overnight. The forest was transformed by new snow, everything clean and white and silent, the kind of beauty that makes you forget the world can be complicated and cruel. The collapsed outbuilding looked exactly as Claire had left it. She directed the agents to the corner where she'd buried the metal box, and they carefully excavated it, documenting every step with photographs and video. When the box emerged, still intact, still sealed, Claire felt something release in her chest, relief so intense it was almost painful. Sarah opened the box with gloved hands, examining each item, verifying it matched the digital documentation. "It's all here. This is extraordinary work, Miss Donovan. You've preserved evidence that could have easily been destroyed or lost." "I didn't do it," Claire said. "Whitmore did. I just found what he left behind." They spent another hour searching the tower, documenting everything, making sure no other hidden caches existed. The FBI agents were thorough and professional, treating the site like the crime scene it technically was, evidence of theft committed 80 years ago, but still prosecutable under cultural property laws. As they were preparing to leave, Claire climbed to the observation room one last time. She stood at the windows, looking out at the vast wilderness, the mountains rolling away in every direction, and thought about Whitmore spending decades in this space, watching over the forest while carrying secrets that grew heavier every year. What had he felt, sitting here day after day, knowing what he knew? Had he hoped someone would eventually find his evidence, or had he resigned himself to taking it to the grave? Michael appeared beside her. "You all right?" "I was just thinking about legacy. What we leave behind." Whitmore spent his whole life guarding this evidence, but he died alone and forgotten. Now his name is going to be attached to one of the biggest art scandals in history. Is that the legacy he wanted? Maybe not. But it's the legacy he earned. Sometimes we don't get to choose how we're remembered, we just get to choose whether we tell the truth. Michael paused. "What about you? What's your plan now?" Claire looked around the observation room, the old maps still taped to walls, the dust thick on every surface, the broken chair where a lonely man had spent years watching for fires and living with ghosts. "I don't know. I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened. But I don't know where else to go either. The Smithsonian is going to need someone to help catalog and research the stolen pieces. Someone who understands archival work, provenance research, the kind of meticulous documentation this project requires. Sarah mentioned she might offer you a position." "She did?" "Consulting position initially, but potentially permanent if the project expands. Which it will. Once this story breaks, other evidence is going to surface. People who've been sitting on information about looted art, afraid to come forward, they're going to see what you did and find courage to speak up. This is going to open floodgates." Claire thought about returning to institutional work, to climate-controlled archives and academic conferences and the safe distance of historical research. A month ago, that would have felt like salvation. Now it felt like retreat. "I don't know if I can go back to that world. To the careful politics, the institutional protection of reputations over truth. I spent 16 years in museums, and I never found anything like this because I never really looked. I was part of the system that let these thefts stay hidden. Then don't go back to who you were. Go forward as who you've become." Michael gestured to the mountains beyond the windows. "You came here broken, running from a life that fell apart. You found something that mattered, something bigger than your own pain. That changes a person. You don't have to retreat into the past, you can build something new." The story broke 3 weeks later. The Smithsonian held a press conference announcing the discovery of documentation proving 73 pieces of art in American museums had been stolen during World War II and laundered into legitimate collections through false provenance. Dr. Sarah Blackwood presented the evidence, with Claire Donovan standing beside her, describing how she'd found Whitmore's cache in an abandoned fire tower in Montana. The media response was immediate and explosive. Major museums issued statements expressing shock and promising full cooperation with investigations. The Carson Museum's director, Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, held her own press conference denying any wrongdoing, insisting her institution had acquired the Rembrandt in good faith and questioning the authenticity of Whitmore's documentation. But the evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss. Within days, independent experts had verified the documents, FBI investigations had confirmed the theft chain, and international agencies had identified the original owners, museums in Vienna, Paris, Amsterdam, and Prague that still had records of pieces stolen during Nazi occupation. The legal process would take years, but the outcome was inevitable. The art would be returned. Claire spent those weeks living in a small apartment the Smithsonian provided, working 18-hour days helping catalog the evidence, contact families of original owners, coordinate with international researchers. The work was exhausting and consuming, but it felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. She was using her skills for something that mattered, something that would return stolen heritage to people who deserved it. The media attention was uncomfortable but manageable. Most coverage focused on the scandal itself, the theft, the cover-up, the institutional failures that had let it persist. Claire was portrayed as the whistleblower, the archivist who'd stumbled onto evidence and done the right thing despite personal risk. Some outlets tried to dig into her personal life, her divorce, her financial struggles, but Sarah ran interference, keeping the focus on the art and the victims of the theft rather than Claire's backstory. In April, 4 months after Claire had bought the tower, the first major repatriation occurred. The Rembrandt was formally returned to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna in a ceremony attended by dignitaries from both countries. Claire attended, standing in the back of the room, watching as the painting was unveiled to applause and tears from museum staff who'd never thought they'd see it again. An elderly woman approached her afterward, someone from the museum's research department, maybe in her 80s, moving slowly with a cane. "You're Miss Donovan? The one who found the evidence?" "Yes, ma'am. My grandfather was a curator here before the war. He tried to hide some of our collection when the Nazis came, but they found most of it anyway. He survived the camps, but he never recovered from losing the art he'd spent his life protecting. He died in 1952, still mourning those lost pieces." Her eyes filled with tears. "He would have wanted me to thank you. For giving back what was stolen. For making sure these treasures came home." Claire couldn't speak, could only nod as the woman embraced her. This was why it mattered, not the institutional scandals or the financial implications, but the human cost. The curators and collectors and families who'd lost pieces of their cultural heritage and spent decades grieving that loss. Now, finally, incompletely but genuinely, some of that heritage was being restored. By summer, Claire had decided not to take the permanent position at the Smithsonian. The work was important, but she'd realized something during those months of intensive research and repatriation. She didn't want to spend her life in institutions anymore, even institutions doing good work. She wanted something different, something connected to the physical world in ways that archives and climate-controlled galleries could never be. She returned to Montana in June, when the high country was finally free of snow and the meadows were brilliant with wildflowers. The tower still stood, condemned and damaged, but the land around it was hers, and the view was still staggering, mountains and forest rolling away forever, sky so vast it made her dizzy. She'd hired a contractor, a local builder named Tom Reeves who specialized in mountain construction, to assess whether the tower could be salvaged or if it needed to be demolished and rebuilt. Tom spent 2 days examining the structure, then delivered his verdict over coffee at the Timberline Diner in the nearest town. "The tower itself is solid, those old-growth beams don't rot easy. But the roof is shot, the windows are gone, and you've got serious water damage throughout. If you want to save it, we're looking at a complete renovation. New roof, new windows, reinforced floor joists, updated foundation. Probably $60,000, minimum." Claire had that money now. The Smithsonian had paid her consulting fees, and several museums that had acquired stolen art had quietly settled with her, not admissions of wrongdoing, but acknowledgement that her discovery had saved them from worse scandal down the line. She had options she hadn't had 6 months ago. She could renovate the tower, or she could sell the property for a profit and start over somewhere else. Tom was watching her expectantly. "What do you want to do?" Claire thought about Whitmore living here for decades, choosing isolation and burden over comfort and silence. She thought about Scout, who'd spent the past months in apartments and hotel rooms but was meant for open spaces and mountain air. She thought about the person she'd been when she arrived here, broken, desperate, running from everything, and the person she'd become through finding Whitmore's evidence and choosing to expose it. "I want to renovate it. Not as a museum or memorial, but as a home. A real home, properly insulated and winterized, with solar panels and water collection and everything needed to live here year-round. You planning to stay? Winters up here are brutal, you'll be snowed in for weeks at a time, no way down the mountain. I know. But I've been thinking about what I want from life now, after everything that's happened. I don't want cities anymore, don't want institutions or careful politics or safe choices. I want to be in a place where the land is real and the weather matters and I can see the whole sky every night. Tom nodded slowly. All right then. We'll start work in July, should have it finished by October before the serious snow comes. But I'm warning you, living up here alone, it's hard. Most people can't handle that much isolation. I won't be completely alone. I've got Scout. And I'm thinking of starting a project, something Whitmore never got to do. She'd been working on the idea for weeks, refining it. A foundation dedicated to researching and recovering looted cultural property. There are thousands of pieces still missing, still in private collections or displayed in museums with false provenance. I want to build a research center here, small but serious, where scholars can come for residencies to work on provenance research. The isolation would be an advantage, no distractions, just focused work in a place that reminds you why truth matters. Tom smiled. That's ambitious. But I like it. This tower was built to watch for fires, to protect the forest. Makes sense to repurpose it for protecting a different kind of heritage. The renovation took 4 months. Claire spent that time living in a small rental in town, working remotely with international researchers, building the foundation's structure and funding base. Several major museums had quietly contributed, motivated partly by genuine support for the mission, partly by desire to appear proactive about provenance research after the scandal. By October, when the first serious snow was threatening, the tower had been transformed. New roof, new windows that could actually keep out weather, reinforced floors, a wood stove that could heat the space efficiently, solar panels providing power, a sophisticated water collection and filtration system. The observation room had been converted into an office space with built-in desks and bookshelves, while the main floor became living quarters, bedroom, kitchen, small library. It would never be luxurious, but it was solid, warm, functional. A real home, not just a condemned structure she was hiding in. The day Claire moved back in, Sarah Blackwood drove up from Missoula where she'd been consulting with the university. She brought a bottle of wine and a housewarming gift, a small bronze plaque that read Whitmore Foundation for Cultural Heritage Research, established 2024. For your door, Sarah said. So visiting scholars know they're in the right place. They mounted it beside the entrance, the metal gleaming in afternoon light. Sarah stepped back to admire it. You've built something good here, Claire. Something that matters. Whitmore would be proud. I hope so. I keep thinking about his letter, about how he apologized for being too afraid to tell the truth while he was alive. I don't want to live like that, carrying important knowledge but being too scared to share it. This foundation, this work, it's about making sure other people don't have to make that choice. If someone finds evidence of looted art, I want them to know there's a place they can bring it, people who will help them expose it without destroying their lives in the process. You're creating what you needed when you found Whitmore's evidence, institutional support for truth-telling. That's powerful work. Sarah paused. You know the scandal isn't over, right? We've repatriated maybe 20 pieces so far, but there are 50 more still in litigation. Museums are fighting return, private collectors are claiming good faith purchases, legal battles are going to drag on for years. It's going to stay messy and complicated. I know. But at least now it's public. At least now people know what happened, and the families who lost art have hope of getting it back. That's more than they had a year ago. They spent that evening sitting by the wood stove, Scout sprawled between them, watching snow begin to fall outside the windows. The first real storm of winter, coming in fast and heavy, the kind that would close roads and isolate the tower for days or weeks. Claire felt no fear, only peace. This was where she belonged now, not running from her old life, but building a new one from the pieces of who she'd been and who she'd become. The tower that had sheltered Whitmore's secrets now sheltered her purpose. The mountains that had witnessed his lonely vigil now witnessed her choosing to carry his mission forward, but without his isolation, without his silence. She would tell the truth, help others tell their truths, and trust that enough people cared about heritage and justice to make the telling worth whatever it cost. Sarah left the next morning before the roads became impassable. Michelchen stopped by a week later, checking on her before the serious winter weather set in. "You sure about this?" he asked, looking around at the renovated tower, the supplies stocked for months of isolation. "Once that snow really hits, you're committed. No changing your mind until spring." "I'm sure." "Good. Because I brought you something." He handed her a box, heavy and carefully wrapped. Inside was the metal container she'd found last January, Whitmore's original evidence box, now returned from FBI custody since all the contents had been digitized and authenticated. "Sarah thought you should have this. It belongs here, in the place where Whitmore kept it safe for so many years." Claire lifted up the leather-bound catalogs, the photographs, the letter. Everything exactly as she'd found it, but somehow transformed by all that had happened since. "I'll keep it in the Foundation archive, so visiting scholars can see where this all started." "That's fitting." Michael hesitated. "There's one more thing. We identified the two people who came to your tower that first night, the ones trying to get in before I showed up. Private investigators hired by a collector in New York, someone who'd purchased pieces with questionable provenance and was trying to suppress Whitmore's evidence before it became public. FBI interviewed them, but they won't face charges. They technically didn't commit any crime, just trespassing. But we stopped them. The evidence went public anyway." "Yes. You stopped them. You and Whitmore together, across 40 years. Claire thought about that after Michael left, how the past reaches forward, how the choices of lonely, frightened people can matter decades later if someone finds what they leave behind and chooses to honor it. She'd come to this tower desperate and broken, looking for nothing more than a place to survive. Instead, she'd found Whitmore's legacy, and in carrying it forward, she'd discovered her own. Spring came eventually, the way it always does in mountains, slowly, reluctantly, the snow receding in patches to reveal earth that had been waiting underneath all along. Claire's first visiting scholar arrived in May, a researcher from Prague working on tracking Czech cultural property looted during the war. They spent 2 weeks in the tower together, working through archives, following leads, documenting theft chains that stretched across continents and generations. More scholars followed, a professor from Amsterdam, a graduate student from Vienna, a curator from Jerusalem. Each one brought pieces of larger puzzles, each one contributed to the slow patient work of recovering what had been stolen and returning it to where it belonged. The foundation grew. By the second year, Claire had to add another structure, a small cabin that could house 2 visiting researchers, giving her privacy in the tower while still maintaining the collaborative work. By the third year, they'd helped recover 18 additional pieces of looted art, each one represented a family's restored heritage, a museum's completed collection, a piece of cultural history finally returned home. And through it all, the tower stood, solid, weathered, bearing witness. Whitmore's ghost, if he had one, could rest now. His evidence had finally been heard, his truth finally told. The art he'd tracked was coming home, and the place where he'd kept his vigil had become something more than just a lookout post for fires. It had become a beacon for truth, a refuge for people brave enough to expose theft and corruption, a reminder that legacy isn't just what we build in our lifetimes, it's what we leave behind for others to find and carry forward. Claire stood in the observation room one evening in summer, watching sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Scout gray-muzzled now but still alert at her side. 5 years since she'd bought this property with her last $9,000. 5 years since she'd found a metal box that changed everything. She thought about Marcus sometimes, wondered if he'd heard about the scandal, if he knew his ex-wife had become someone he wouldn't recognize. She thought about her old life in Boston, the careful academic career she'd abandoned. But mostly, she thought about the land beneath her feet, the mountains rising forever, the scholars working in the cabin below, and the slow patient work of making things right that had been wrong for too long. The tower's foundations were old-growth timber, the kind that lasts centuries if it's treated right. Claire figured she had time. Time to build the foundation into something that would outlive her. Time to help other whistleblowers find courage to come forward. Time to watch the mountains change with seasons while doing work that mattered in ways she'd never imagined when she first drove up that forest road, desperate and afraid. Time to prove that sometimes, when everything falls apart, you find exactly what you were meant to find. Not safety, not certainty, but purpose. And in the end, that was worth more than any life she'd lost. 10 years after Claire Donovan bought an abandoned fire tower with her last $9,000, the Whitmore Foundation had become something she'd never imagined in those early desperate days. The compound now consisted of 4 structures: the original tower, fully restored and serving as her private residence and the Foundation's administrative center, 2 research cabins that could house visiting scholars, and a small archive building where the most sensitive documents were preserved in climate-controlled storage. The access road had been improved, graded and maintained by the county after the Foundation had negotiated an easement agreement. Solar arrays covered a south-facing slope, providing reliable power year-round. A sophisticated satellite internet system kept the remote location connected to researchers and institutions worldwide. But despite the improvements, the essential character of the place remained unchanged, isolated, austere, demanding. The kind of place that either broke you or remade you, with no middle ground. Claire was 52 now, her hair showing silver at the temples, her hands weathered from years of mountain living. Scout had passed 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep after a long life that had taken him from Boston suburbs to Montana wilderness. She'd buried him at the edge of the clearing with a simple marker bearing his name and the words "faithful companion" through every journey. A new dog now kept her company, a young German shepherd named Echo who'd been trained as a search and rescue dog before an injury had ended that career. He had Scout's intelligence and intensity, that same quality of being fully present in every moment. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond anyone's initial projections. They'd helped recover and repatriate over 200 pieces of looted cultural property, not just from World War II, but from various conflicts and colonial periods spanning centuries. The model Claire had developed, providing institutional support and legal protection for whistleblowers, maintaining confidential research capabilities, working patiently through complex provenance chains, had proven remarkably effective. Museums were more willing to cooperate now, understanding that voluntary transparency was preferable to public scandal. Governments had established new protocols for investigating suspicious acquisitions. International agencies coordinated better on tracking stolen cultural heritage. The original scandal that had started everything, the 73 pieces documented by Thomas Whitmore, had finally been fully resolved just last year. The final piece, a Renaissance sculpture that had been tied up in litigation for nearly a decade, had been returned to its original museum in Florence during a ceremony that Claire had attended. Standing in that ancient building, watching Italian officials unveil the returned sculpture to applause and tears, she'd felt a sense of completion. Whitmore's mission, the burden he'd carried alone for 40 years, was finally finished. Every piece he'd documented had been identified, every theft acknowledged, every treasure returned home. But the work continued. New cases arrived regularly, descendants of Holocaust victims reaching out with family stories about lost art, researchers discovering suspicious gaps in museum documentation, dealers who'd learned uncomfortable truths about pieces they'd sold years ago and wanted to make things right. Each case required patience, careful documentation, and the kind of meticulous research Claire had been trained for in her museum days but now applied to serving justice rather than protecting institutions. She wasn't alone in the work anymore. The Foundation employed 3 full-time researchers and hosted a rotating group of visiting scholars. Sarah Blackwood had retired from the Smithsonian 2 years ago and now spent half the year at the tower, mentoring young researchers and applying her decades of expertise to the most complex cases. Michael Chen had taken early retirement from the Park Service and worked as the Foundation's field investigator, using his law enforcement background to track down leads that required physical investigation rather than archival research. On this particular morning in early September, Claire stood in the observation room that had become her office, looking out at mountains touched by the first hints of autumn gold. The view never stopped moving her, the vastness of it, the way weather systems played across those distant peaks, the sense of being small in the face of something ancient and enduring. Her laptop pinged with an incoming video call. She accepted it, and a young woman's face appeared on screen, maybe 30 years old, dark hair, nervous expression. "Dr. Donovan? My name is Anna Kowalski. I was referred to you by the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. They said you might be able to help with something I found. Please, call me Claire. Tell me what you've discovered." Anna's story unfolded slowly, hesitantly. Her great-grandfather had been a pianist in Warsaw before the war, a man of some local renown who'd owned a small but valuable collection of musical manuscripts, original scores by Chopin, Paderewski, other Polish composers. When the Nazis invaded, he'd hidden the manuscripts, hoping to protect them. He'd been deported to Treblinka and murdered there in 1942. The manuscripts had never been recovered. Anna had spent years researching what happened to her great-grandfather's collection, following fragmentary leads through archives across Europe and America. Recently, she'd discovered that several of the manuscripts had surfaced in a private collection in Chicago in 1958, sold by a dealer who claimed they'd been purchased from a European estate. But Anna had found documents suggesting the dealer had actually acquired them through black market channels, knowing they were stolen property but falsifying their provenance. The current owner is an elderly man, a major philanthropist who's donated millions to cultural institutions over his lifetime. His collection is scheduled to be donated to a major music conservatory after his death. If those manuscripts are in his collection, they'll become part of a public institution, displayed under false provenance, and my family will never know what happened to the treasures my great-grandfather died trying to protect. Anna's voice broke slightly. I don't want to destroy this man's reputation. He probably acquired them in good faith decades ago. But those manuscripts belong to my family. They're the only physical legacy we have from the great-grandfather we never got to meet. I want them back. Claire listened to the entire story, taking notes, asking careful questions. When Anna finished, Claire said gently, "This is going to be complicated. Musical manuscripts are harder to trace than paintings, there's less documentation, fewer photographic records. And if the current owner acquired them legally under the laws at the time, even if the original theft was wrong, the legal situation becomes murky." "I know. That's why I need help. The Holocaust Museum said you were the best at navigating these situations, that you'd help dozens of families recover looted property even in complicated cases. We'll do everything we can. Send me all the documentation you have, photographs, provenance records, any evidence connecting these specific manuscripts to your great-grandfather's collection. We'll research the dealer who sold them, trace the chain of custody, and see if we can build a case for return. It may take months or years, but if those manuscripts were stolen, we'll help you get them back." After the call ended, Claire sat for a moment looking at her notes. Another family, another stolen heritage, another chance to make something right that had been wrong for generations. This was what the work had become, not just recovering the high-value museum pieces that made headlines, but helping individual families reclaim personal treasures that mattered more for emotional than monetary value. She thought about her own life, about the treasures she'd lost, not to theft, but to divorce, death, the ordinary violence of time and circumstance. Her marriage to Marcus, her home in Cambridge, her safe academic career, all of it gone in ways that couldn't be restored through research and legal proceedings. But she'd found something else, something she couldn't have imagined when she was driving up that forest road 10 years ago, desperate and broken. She'd found purpose that felt true. Work that mattered not because it was prestigious or well compensated, but because it served justice in small, precise ways. A community of scholars and researchers who cared about truth more than reputation. And she'd found this place, these mountains, this tower, this life built on the foundation of a lonely man's courage and her own decision to honor it. That evening, the foundation's small staff gathered for dinner in the main tower, a weekly tradition that Claire insisted on maintaining. Sarah prepared her famous pasta, Michael grilled vegetables on the propane barbecue outside, and the 3 young researchers who were currently in residence contributed salad and bread. They ate at the long handmade table that had been in the tower since Whitmore's time, refinished and restored but still bearing the marks of decades of use. Conversation flowed easily, discussion of current cases, news from the art world, gossip about academics and curators they all knew. But underneath the casual talk was the deeper bond that had formed among them, the knowledge that they were doing work most people would never understand or appreciate, work that required patience and integrity and willingness to challenge powerful institutions. After dinner, as the others cleaned up, Claire climbed to the observation room and stood at the windows watching darkness settle over the mountains. Stars emerged, brilliant and cold, the Milky Way visible as a river of light across the sky. She heard footsteps on the ladder and turned to see Sarah joining her, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you might want company," Sarah said, handing her a glass. "Always." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Sarah said, "I've been thinking about retirement. Real retirement, not the working half-time version I'm doing now." Claire felt her stomach drop. "You're leaving?" "Not leaving. Just stepping back. I'm 71, Claire. I've spent 50 years in provenance research, and I'm tired. The foundation is in good hands. You've built something sustainable here, something that will continue long after all of us are gone. But I need to spend my remaining time differently. Travel without deadlines. Read books that aren't about art theft. Sleep past dawn occasionally. I understand. And you're right, the foundation will continue. But I'm going to miss working with you every day. We'll still collaborate on cases. And I'll visit regularly. This place has become important to me, what you've built here. It reminds me why I got into this work originally, before it became about academic credentials and museum politics. Here, it's just about doing right by people who've been wronged. That's pure in a way nothing else in the art world is anymore." They talked for another hour, reminiscing about cases they'd worked together, laughing about difficult curators they'd dealt with, discussing plans for the foundation's future expansion. When Sarah headed down to bed, Claire remained at the window, processing the news. Change was inevitable, people aged, circumstances shifted, nothing stayed the same forever. But the work would continue. That was what mattered. The foundation had become larger than any individual. It would outlive them all, serving families and institutions in truth for as long as such service was needed. A week later, Claire made the drive down to the nearest town, a 40-minute trip over improved but still challenging roads. She went monthly now, to pick up supplies, check a post office box, have coffee with local friends she'd made over the years. The town had grown slightly, tourism increasing as Montana became fashionable among wealthy urbanites looking for authentic wilderness experiences. But the core character remained, practical, reserved, the kind of place where people judged you by your actions over years, not your words and moments. She stopped at the diner where she'd first eaten a decade ago. The owner, Grace, was still behind the counter, grayer now but still moving with the same efficient competence. "Claire. Haven't seen you in a month. How's things up at the tower?" "Good. Busy. We've got 3 visiting scholars right now, working on different cases. I read about that sculpture you helped return to Italy. Made the news even out here. You're doing important work up there." They talked for a few minutes, the easy conversation of people who'd known each other long enough that silences were comfortable. As Claire was paying, Grace said, "There was someone in here last week asking about you. Well-dressed woman, expensive car. Said she was writing an article about the foundation, wanted to know what locals thought of you." Claire felt a familiar wariness. "What did you tell her?" "That you kept to yourself mostly, but you were good people. That the work you were doing mattered, bringing stolen art back to families who'd lost it." She seemed satisfied with that, didn't push for gossip. Grace paused. "But there was something about her I didn't quite trust. Too smooth, too practiced. Made me think she wasn't really a journalist, or if she was, she had some other agenda. Thanks for the heads up. I'll be careful." Driving back up the mountain, Claire thought about the warning. The foundation's work inevitably made enemies, collectors whose acquisitions were exposed as stolen property, dealers whose provenance documentation was revealed as fraudulent, museums whose reputations were damaged by having to return pieces. Most accepted the evidence gracefully, recognizing that the truth needed to come out regardless of personal cost. But some fought back, trying to discredit the foundation or intimidate its staff. It was part of the work, the price of challenging powerful institutions and wealthy collectors. Back at the tower, she mentioned the incident to Michael, who promised to be alert for any unusual activity around the property. They'd installed security cameras years ago after a break-in attempt, and the system had proven its worth several times. But Claire refused to let security concerns dominate her thinking. She'd learned over the years that fear was corrosive, that living cautiously meant not living fully. Better to do the work that mattered and accept whatever risks came with it. Autumn deepened into winter. Snow came early that year, heavy storms in October that isolated the tower for days at a time. But the foundation's operations continued. Research didn't require physical access, only internet connectivity and determination. Claire worked through cases, corresponded with families, coordinated with museums and government agencies. The rhythm of the work had become second nature, as natural as breathing. In December, on the 10-year anniversary of her purchasing the property, Claire hosted a small celebration. Sarah came up from her winter home in Missoula. Michael drove in from town. The current visiting scholars contributed food and stories. They gathered around the wood stove, sharing wine and memories and hopes for the foundation's future. Michael raised his glass. To Claire, who had the courage to honor someone else's truth. And to Thomas Whitmore, who preserved that truth even when it cost him everything. Their partnership across time has changed the world in ways we're still discovering. They drank to that, and Claire felt emotion tighten her throat. She'd never thought of it as a partnership before, but Michael was right. She and Whitmore, separated by decades, had worked together, he preserving the evidence, she bringing it to light. Neither could have succeeded alone. It took both courage and timing, documentation and exposure, patience and action. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Claire climbed to the observation room one final time. Echo followed, settling at her feet. She looked out at the winter mountains, stark and beautiful under moonlight, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. 10 years ago, she'd been someone else entirely, careful, conventional, broken by divorce and loss. The tower had remade her into someone braver, someone willing to fight for truth even when fighting cost everything, someone who understood that legacy wasn't about personal achievement but about serving something larger than yourself. She thought about all the families they'd helped, all the treasures returned, all the wrongs slowly being made right. The work would never be finished, there would always be more stolen property to recover, more families seeking lost heritage, more institutions that needed to confront uncomfortable truths about their collections. But progress was real. Each piece returned, each truth acknowledged, each family reunited with lost treasures, all of it mattered. All of it justified the years of patient, difficult work. And the tower would stand, would continue standing, long after she was gone. Other researchers would come, would use the resources she'd built, would carry the mission forward. Whitmore's legacy and her own would merge into something larger, a permanent institution dedicated to the proposition that cultural heritage mattered, that theft demanded restitution regardless of how much time had passed, that truth served justice in ways nothing else could. The mountains were eternal, or close enough that human lifespans made no difference. They'd been here before the tower was built, before Whitmore kept his lonely vigil, before Claire arrived desperate and seeking refuge. They'd be here long after the foundation completed its work, after the last stolen treasure was returned, after everyone currently alive had become memory and dust. But while she was here, while there was work to do and families to serve and truths to expose, Claire would continue. Not from obligation, but from choice. Not from desperation, but from purpose. She'd found what she'd been seeking without knowing she was seeking it, a life that felt authentic, work that mattered, a place that demanded everything and gave back meaning. The tower had given her that. Whitmore's evidence had given her that. The mountains and sky and endless horizon had given her that. She finished her wine and set down the glass. Echo stirred, ready to follow her downstairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to serve justice in small precise ways. But tonight, standing in this observation room where a frightened man had once kept secrets and a broken woman had once found courage, Claire felt complete. Not happy in any simple sense, the work was too hard for happiness, but fulfilled in ways that mattered more than happiness ever could. The land had seen everything: Whitmore's fear, Claire's desperation, their separate choices to serve truth despite personal cost. And the land remembered, held those stories in soil and stone and the roots of ancient trees. Someday, someone else would stand here, would look out at these mountains and feel what Claire felt now: the weight of legacy, the responsibility of truth, the quiet satisfaction of work that served something larger than self. That was enough. That was everything. Claire descended the ladder, Echo padding beside her, and went to bed in the tower that had become her home. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering everything in white. The mountains stood eternal against the sky. And somewhere in the darkness, carried on wind that never stopped moving, the stories continued, of theft and recovery, loss and restoration, fear and courage, desperation and purpose. Stories that would be told as long as anyone cared about truth, as long as families sought lost heritage, as long as the tower stood watching over wilderness that remembered everything and forgave nothing and witnessed all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.